Rev up your engines. Okay, here's a lady who's got a problem with her Chevy Sonic. She's been to 3 places. Nobody can figure it out. Okay, let's figure out what's wrong with this thing. Other than the fact that it's a Chevy Sonic. We'll plug it in, see what the machine says. Here we go. It's popping up, finding out what it is. There's the VIN scan, smart scan. Here we go. It's going to go through all these systems. Now, just to keep things up to speed, this thing has had the knock sensor replaced twice because it had knock sensor code. They even replaced the pigtail connector. They thought that had a problem, and it's still tripping the knock sensor code. Now, we'll just get this out of the way. It has a radio code. That we don't care about. The ECM. Engine underboost and knock sensor circuit. So let's read the freeze frame data. We'll start with the knock sensor. When it was just idling at a stop, the engine was warmed up, was only idling 841 RPM at an idle. This is a 1.4 liter engine, but the MAF sensor at the time was 4.86 grams per second, which is a bit high for an idle on this thing. Look at the engine underboost. That was when it wasn't as warm, when the engine was going 1988 RPMs, and it was going 55 miles an hour. So those codes happened at completely different times. One was at idle, and one was at 55 miles an hour. So let's see if there's any tests we can do. Through actuation tests. Through ignition timing. Now it's idling, but as you can see, the ignition timing is all over the place. 6.5, 9.5, 7, 8. It should not be bouncing around like that. Higher speeds, it's leveling off. We rev it up, but when we let it come to an idle, as you can see, it's going all over the place. 5, 8, 8.5, 6.5. Now this thing does have 88,000 miles on it. It's going to be, the timing chain is worn. Now one of the disadvantages of these little engines, this is a 1.4 turbocharged engine. You get more power with a turbo, it's gonna wear out faster. You can even hear this chain rattling a little. Not a regular mechanic, that's over $1,000 job replacing the timing chain, assuming other things aren't broken inside the engine. And what we have here is a typical misdiagnosis. 3 separate mechanics worked on it. They all said it needs a knock sensor, wiring harness, blah, 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 blah. No, that is the effect of the timing chain being off. If the chain is worn, you're going to have incorrect ignition timing. And if the timing is so far off, guess what? It makes the engine knock. The knock sensor picks up the knock. Then the computer thinks, oh, the knock sensor, yeah, it's knocky. Doesn't mean the sensor's bad. In this case, it's reporting the information correctly, but the information that it's getting is bad because the timing chain itself is worn, so the ignition timing is bouncing all over the place, especially at idle, where when they're loose, they bounce around, but when you rev it real hard, they're spinning so fast that compensates for any wear. They're spinning so fast it's tight enough that the timing advances correctly. And when a computer system sees these problems, it won't allow the turbocharger to kick in. And she said she lost turbocharger driving on a highway, hence it has that code for the turbocharger. But just for giggles, we'll do some turbocharger tests. It said underboost, so I'm assuming it's bypassing it. We'll try the bypass solenoid. Turn it on. Now it's active. We'll take it for a little spin. It's obviously boosting because it's got plenty of power. So that's working. It's commanded on. Well, let's turn it off. Let's release the control. Turn it off. Now the turbo's stopped. It's got a little leg. You can see it's got turbo leg now. Try something from scratch here. What we're going to do is we're going to clear everything. We'll turn the key off, turn it back on, clear fault code, start the car. We can see the check engine light that was on is now off, and let's road test it. While we're road testing it, we're going to record it all. So here we go. We'll run it through its paces while the machine records everything. Our little racetrack. If anything weird goes on, we can analyze the data it's recording. So there's some slow people in front of us. We'll come to a stop. They seem pretty far ahead. Here we go. The turbo's kicking in. Even with a turbo, it accelerates pretty slowly. I stopped the recording, so we have that recording. When I come to a stop, we'll start another recording. Since it erased the codes and that knock sensor code popped when the car was just idling, we're going to come to an idle and record it a little. As the machine records the idling, gets all the data, we'll see if something's squirrely when it's idling. So now we're back home and we can analyze the data. You can see it hasn't tripped any codes yet during our road test. So it's a problem that's going to be relatively hard to diagnose. But voila, the check engine light just came back on. So the light came back on. So did the knock sensor circuit. So, got the freeze frame. Freeze frame is the same as the old. It's not moving. It's 0%. It was idling at 824 RPM. And it was only going 1.24 miles per hour. As I said, the slower speeds, timing chain's worn, it'll make the engine knock. Sure, my diagnosis. I'm doing engine speed, ignition, timing, and retarding. I've recorded it, and we're going to play it back. We go back to the Think file. It has the file of what we recorded, and it was the last one we did. Data stream playback, look at ignition, timing, and engine speed. We're going to play it back and watch the data. As it's cruising along, the ignition is changing like it should. You can see the timing's jumping all over the place. We're going to wait till it comes back to an idle. Now you can see it's idling. 3 degrees, 4 degrees, -2 degrees, 3.5, -3, 7 degrees, all while it's idling. Timing is just too unstable. As the chain wears, it's moving around, the correlation between the camshafts and the crankshafts, which set ignition timing, are changing all the time because the chain's bouncing around. That's what's making this car trip that stupid knock sensor code. Now, unfortunately, these engines often have timing chain problems because, as I've said over and over again, you get a little 1.4 turbo engine, you drive it hard, it's going to wear the engine out fast. Now, yes, it could have a bad timing chain tensioner, but even that on this little puddle jumper is over a $900 job. And once you start taking these old engines apart, you don't know what's wrong with them without a full rebuild. They only last so long and not any longer. That's why I advise people not to buy them in the first place. Because this check engine light being on and tripping a code for the knock sensor, that's the tip of the iceberg. The engine is causing the problem, not the sensor. Guys replaced the sensor twice. They were foolhardy to do that. They could have used one of these scan tools, replace the first one and watch the data and see what was going on, instead of changing another one and then changing the wiring harness for it and still getting the same code back. Got bad timing, which is going to make the knock sensor give weird data, because if the timing's off, the engine's not going to run right. It's going to knock and it's going to turn the code on. It's not the sensor that's the problem. The sensor is just telling you, hey, there's a problem in your engine. Now you get to figure out what the heck it is. And 3 other mechanics couldn't figure out what the heck it was. 85,000 miles and timing chain's worn out. My friend down the road, he did one with 65,000 miles on it with a timing chain worn out. They're just not well made. My advice, stay away from them. But at least if you want to know what's wrong, hey, bring it to Scotty, I'll tell you. And here's some bonus questions and answers. Joe Mel says, which new shock should I get from a Honda Accord Sport 2014? I'm a full-time Uber driver. I need recommendation on shocks. I heard you recommend KYB. I'm not sure if they're good still or not. KYB makes pretty good shock struts. You got a Honda Accord Sport. You got the Sport one. It has the fancy suspension. If you really wanted to ride the same and handle the same, I would go and buy them from Honda, because the original equipment ones on the Sport are a little bit fancier. The KYBs are perfectly fine, but you got the Sport. If you would have had a regular Honda, not the Sport, I'd say go ahead and get KYBs. But you might not be happy. If you like the way it drove, go to the Honda dealer and get the OEM ones, because they are specifically made for the sports. They're upgraded, and Honda makes pretty good products. You're going to pay a little bit more, but you'll get the same ride, because the KYBs, they're more or less generic, where the Sport has a special sport suspension system on it. And you'd probably be better off buying the OEM Honda ones if you like the way it is. Now, if you want an all-around good ride, go ahead and get the KYBs. They're a lot cheaper. Renzo85 says, I got a 2017 Honda Civic with starting problems. I just purchased a 2017 Civic hatchback 1.5 turbo. It's a knock-around car. 20 miles a day. Sometimes I have a problem starting if it sits the night. I have to turn the key all the way, smack the dash for it to start. Any ideas? Yeah, replace the ignition switch. It's a known failure on Hondas. Get the electrical portion of the ignition switch and replace it. You can even buy this stuff at AutoZone, O'Reilly, wherever. They sell ignition switches for them. Just the electrical part, not the key part, but the electrical part. They are notorious for going bad. Do that. It's a simple thing to do. You're hitting the dash that wobbles it around, and that almost always fixes it. Now, you could have a wiring short, too. If the car, you bought it recent, maybe it was wrecked or flooded or stolen, who knows. But generally it just means you put another ignition switch, the electrical portion, that usually fix it. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.